The stars above the battlefield shimmered like spectators to a grand, unforgiving spectacle. The planet Arcones was an expanse of crimson sand stretching endlessly under a sky veined with crackling green lightning. Amid this harsh beauty, Commander Rena tightened her grip on her rifle, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The invincible Arcones vanguard stood beside her, a force engineered to dominate. Clad in black exosuits that pulsed with kinetic energy, they were the galaxy's most feared soldiers, a living embodiment of destruction. Rena had never questioned their prowess. For years, they had been unstoppable, claiming victory after victory. This battle was expected to be no different. The enemy, a scattered rebellion of under-equipped fighters from Earth, was considered an afterthought. Their leader, General Corin Vega, was known for his cunning but lacked the resources to make any dent in the Empire's plans. As the vanguard prepared for the assault, Rena couldn't shake an unfamiliar tension in her chest, a feeling she dismissed as the strain of yet another routine operation. The vanguard marched forward, their steps synchronized, creating a rhythmic thunder across the desert. A storm began to gather, casting eerie shadows over the battlefield. Rena followed behind, her tactical visor feeding her live updates. The rebels were visible now, scattered across the dunes in mismatched armor. They held their position, motionless, as if waiting for something. It was odd. Usually, opponents would scatter at the sight of the vanguard, scrambling for any semblance of cover. But these humans stood still, almost serene. A low hum filled the air. It wasn't coming from the rebels but from the sand beneath them. Rena signaled a halt. The vanguard froze mid-stride, their exosuits emitting faint whirs as they adjusted their stance. The hum grew louder, resonating through the ground like a pulse. The rebels, still unmoving, began to smile faintly. That's when Rena saw it, a ripple spreading across the desert, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Before anyone could react, the ripple exploded into chaos. Sand geysers erupted, engulfing the vanguard in blinding clouds of red dust. Rebel soldiers emerged from the swirling haze, not from the dunes but from hidden tunnels beneath them. The first wave of attackers moved with precision, wielding weapons unfamiliar to Rena, devices emitting flashes of light that disoriented the exosuits. The vanguard, disoriented, hesitated for the first time Rena could recall. Rena shouted orders, her voice cutting through the chaos. The vanguard recalibrated, their armor adapting to the new threat, and they began to push back. The rebels didn't retreat, though. They danced around the mighty soldiers, striking swiftly before vanishing into the storm. Rena's visor flared with error messages. The suits were malfunctioning. It wasn't just the weapons. The sand itself seemed to cling to the exosuits, clogging their mechanisms. Rena locked eyes with one of the rebel leaders, a woman with a determined gaze, her armor scratched but functional. She raised her hand, and the rebels ceased their assault for a brief moment. The woman smiled, a mix of defiance and understanding. This wasn't a fight they intended to win through brute force. They had studied their enemy, found its weaknesses, and exploited them with a precision Rena could only admire. As the storm intensified, the vanguard struggled to regroup. Rena's mind raced. This wasn't about brute strength or firepower anymore. The humans had turned the terrain into their weapon, and for the first time in her career, Rena felt an unsettling truth take root: they were not invincible. The chaos intensified as the rebels pressed their advantage. The storm's fury merged with the precision of their attacks, turning the desert into a battlefield unlike any Rena had faced. The once formidable vanguard struggled to adapt. Their exosuits, designed for raw combat dominance, were becoming a liability. Sand coated the joints, slowing their movements, while the strange pulses from the rebels' weapons disrupted their internal systems. For every step the vanguard took, the rebels seemed 2 steps ahead. Rena barked orders into her comms, trying to rally her troops. "Reform the line! Hold positions and reset your systems!" But her commands were met with static and garbled responses. The storm had disrupted their communications. The coordination that had made the vanguard invincible was unraveling before her eyes. Through the swirling sand, Rena spotted a group of rebels advancing toward her position. She dropped to her knees, aimed her rifle, and fired a precise burst. 2 rebels fell, but the others pressed forward, undeterred. One hurled a small, glowing device that detonated mid-air, unleashing an electromagnetic pulse. Rena's visor went dark, and her rifle sputtered lifelessly. She cursed under her breath and threw the rifle aside, drawing her sidearm. As she fired, a shadow loomed over her. A vanguard soldier, his armor scorched and dented, stepped between her and the advancing rebels. The soldier unleashed a barrage from his gauntlet-mounted cannon, forcing the attackers to retreat. Rena glanced at his helmet, recognizing him instantly. It was Derek, one of her most loyal troops. "Commander," Derek's voice crackled through his suit's external speakers. "We're losing ground. These humans, they've anticipated everything." Rena nodded grimly. "We need to regroup and counterattack, but we can't fight them on their terms. We have to change the rules." Derek tilted his head slightly, awaiting her orders. Rena scanned the battlefield, her mind racing. The storm was both a hindrance and an opportunity. The rebels had used it to their advantage, but it also meant visibility was limited for both sides. If the vanguard could adapt quickly enough, they might regain control. "Derek, gather what remains of our forces. Form a perimeter around the damaged units and deploy suppressive fire to push the rebels back. We'll use the storm to mask our movements and create an opening to strike their command center." Derek hesitated for a moment, then saluted. "Understood, Commander." He sprinted off into the haze, his cannon blazing as he rallied the scattered soldiers. Rena activated her suit's manual override, bypassing the damaged systems. The exosuit hummed back to life, though at reduced capacity. She grabbed a compact beacon from her belt and activated it. A holographic map flickered into view, displaying the battlefield in grainy detail. The rebels' movements were erratic but focused around a central point, a mobile command unit hidden beneath the dunes. She smirked. "So that's their nerve center." Her comms crackled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a fragmented message to her troops. "Reposition, storm, disrupt their base." The rest was lost in static, but she hoped it was enough for her forces to understand. Rena moved quickly, using the storm as cover. She slid down a dune, her boots digging into the loose sand to slow her descent. Ahead, she spotted a group of rebels guarding an entrance to the hidden command unit. They were heavily armed but seemed unaware of her approach. She crouched behind a jagged rock, formulating her plan. The vanguard's strength had always been brute force, but today that wasn't an option. The humans had outmaneuvered them at every turn, forcing her to think like them, adaptive, cunning, and resourceful. Reaching into her utility pouch, Rena pulled out a handful of microdetonators. The rebels might have advanced technology, but they wouldn't expect an old-fashioned diversion. She hurled the devices in a wide arc, each one detonating with a deafening bang. The guards scrambled, their formation breaking as they searched for the source of the explosions. Rena seized the opportunity, sprinting toward the entrance. She took down the closest guard with a swift blow to the head, disarmed another, and disabled the rest with precise shots from her sidearm. Breathing heavily, she slipped into the tunnel leading to the command unit. The narrow passageway was dimly lit, the walls reinforced with makeshift supports. Rena's footsteps echoed as she moved cautiously, her weapon at the ready. She could hear voices ahead, rebels coordinating their attack. She pressed herself against the wall, peeking around the corner. The command unit was a hive of activity, with holographic displays showing the battlefield and a group of officers issuing orders. Rena's lips curled into a determined grin. They had underestimated her. That was their first mistake. She reached for her last remaining microdetonator, setting it to overload. If she could destroy the command center, the rebels would lose their coordination, and the vanguard might have a chance to turn the tide. Rena stepped into the room, her voice cutting through the chaos. "End of the line," she said, tossing the detonator onto the central console. The rebels turned, their faces a mixture of shock and fury, but it was too late. The device beeped ominously, and Rena dove for cover as the explosion rocked the tunnel. The explosion sent a shockwave through the tunnel, collapsing parts of the command unit, and plunging the space into chaos. Smoke and debris filled the air as alarms blared. Rena pulled herself up from where she'd taken cover, coughing through the haze. The rebels, disoriented and reeling from the blast, scrambled to regain control. Holographic maps flickered erratically, and the hum of their systems faltered. She could feel the tide shifting, but the battle was far from over. One of the rebel officers spotted her through the smoke, raising his weapon. Rena reacted instinctively, diving to the side and returning fire. Her shots were precise, neutralizing the threat before he could pull the trigger. She knew she couldn't linger. Reinforcements would arrive soon, and she had to finish what she'd started. As Rena advanced deeper into the command center, she found herself face to face with the rebel leader. It was the same woman she had seen earlier on the battlefield, her calm defiance now replaced with smoldering rage. The leader stood her ground, holding an unfamiliar weapon that glowed with an ominous blue light. "I underestimated you," the woman said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're not like the others." Rena smirked, her sidearm trained on the leader. "You're right. I adapt." Before either could fire, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The storm outside had grown into a full-blown tempest, and the unstable tunnels were beginning to collapse. Large chunks of rock fell from the ceiling, forcing both women to dive for cover. The rebel leader glanced at Rena, her expression briefly betraying concern, not for herself, but for the soldiers still in the command center. Rena hesitated. For all their cunning and defiance, the rebels weren't ruthless killers. They fought with strategy, not malice. It was a stark contrast to the Empire's relentless domination. She didn't have time to dwell on it. The room shook again, and a massive crack split the wall, revealing a way out, but it wouldn't stay open for long. "Call off your troops," Rena shouted over the noise, her voice filled with urgency. "This whole place is going to collapse." The leader hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if weighing the risk. Then she lowered her weapon and activated a device on her wrist. Across the battlefield, the rebel forces began to retreat, their movements coordinated even in the face of chaos. Rena's comms buzzed faintly, and she caught fragments of her own troops reporting the withdrawal. The vanguard was regrouping, seizing the moment to reclaim lost ground. But Rena's focus remained on the command center. She motioned toward the crack in the wall. "Go. Take whoever's left with you." The rebel leader stared at her, confusion and suspicion flickering across her face. "Why are you doing this?" Rena didn't answer. She turned and moved toward the exit, her sidearm ready in case the leader decided to betray her trust. The tunnels continued to collapse around them, and the sound of retreating footsteps echoed through the chaos. As she emerged from the command center, Rena saw the battlefield in disarray. The storm had subsided slightly, revealing the vanguard rallying their forces. Derek stood at the forefront, his armor scorched but functional. He raised a hand in acknowledgement as Rena approached. "Commander," he said, his voice crackling through his helmet. "The rebels are retreating. What's the next move?" Rena's gaze swept across the battlefield, taking in the wounded soldiers and the ruined landscape. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure what victory looked like. The rebels had forced them to adapt, to think beyond their usual tactics. They had shown her a side of humanity the Empire had tried to crush: resilience, ingenuity, and a refusal to give up, even against impossible odds. "Hold the line," she said finally. "Let them go. We've done enough damage for one day." Derek hesitated, clearly surprised by her order, but he didn't argue. He signaled to the remaining vanguard, who began securing the area and tending to their wounded. Rena looked back toward the collapsed tunnels, wondering if the rebel leader had made it out alive. There was no way to know for sure, but a part of her hoped she had. Despite their differences, they had shared a moment of understanding in the chaos, however fleeting it might have been. As the sun began to set over the crimson desert, Rena felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. The vanguard had held the line, but it was clear that their invincibility was a myth. The rebels had exposed their vulnerabilities, forcing them to confront their reliance on brute strength and unwavering obedience. For the first time, Rena found herself questioning the empire she had sworn to serve. The battle wasn't just a test of strength, it was a clash of ideals, a reminder that even the most unstoppable force could be brought to its knees by ingenuity and the will to survive. She tightened her grip on her weapon and turned toward the vanguard's camp. There were still battles to be fought, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The storm had passed, but its impact would linger long after the sands had settled. The battlefield had fallen into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of smoldering debris and the distant howl of the waning storm. Rena stood at the edge of the vanguard's perimeter, watching as her soldiers tended to their wounds and salvaged what they could. The rebels had vanished into the dunes, their retreat calculated and efficient, leaving no trace except the undeniable mark they had left on the vanguard's pride. Derek approached, his armor caked in sand and ash, his expression somber. The wounded have been stabilized. We're gathering intel from what's left of their equipment. But, he hesitated, his usual confidence replaced with a rare uncertainty. Rena turned to him. But what? They broke us, Commander. The vanguard wasn't supposed to falter, yet they made us retreat, regroup, and question ourselves. He looked at the battlefield, his voice dropping. Are we even what we claim to be anymore? Rena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her gaze drift across the horizon, where the crimson sands stretched endlessly under a now calm sky. She understood his doubt because she felt it too. The vanguard had been engineered to embody invincibility, their strength forged through technology and discipline. But today, they had been outwitted by a force with fewer resources but far greater adaptability. Derek, she began, her voice steady but reflective. This wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was a lesson. Strength alone doesn't guarantee victory. They saw us coming, studied us, and found our weaknesses. That's something we've never been forced to confront before. He nodded slowly, though the weight of her words clearly unsettled him. And what do we do with that lesson, Commander? How do we move forward? Before Rena could respond, a small device on her wrist buzzed to life. It was a signal, not from the vanguard but from a secure, unregistered channel. She activated it cautiously, and a faint voice crackled through. You spared us when you didn't have to. The voice was unmistakably the rebel leader's, calm yet tinged with exhaustion. We've left the battlefield, but don't mistake our retreat for surrender. We'll be back better prepared. Rena frowned, her mind racing. Why contact me now? To gloat? The leader's chuckle was faint but audible. No. To offer a warning. You're not invincible, Commander. Neither are we. But we fight for something we believe in. Can you say the same? The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Rena with the unsettling echo of the rebel's question. She stared at the device for a moment before deactivating it. Derek, who had overheard the conversation, looked at her with a mixture of confusion and concern. What was that about? Perspective, Rena replied, though the word felt heavier than she intended. The vanguard's camp grew quieter as night fell. The soldiers gathered around makeshift fires, their exocets powered down to conserve energy. For the first time, Rena saw them not as invincible warriors but as people, tired, bruised, and questioning. The facade of their perfection had cracked, and through it, humanity was beginning to show. Rena walked among them, offering words of encouragement where she could, but mostly listening. The soldiers spoke of the battle in hushed tones, their pride bruised but not broken. They shared stories of close calls and acts of bravery, clinging to the camaraderie that had held them together in the storm. As she returned to her tent, Rena found herself replaying the rebel leader's words in her mind. The Empire had always painted itself as the pinnacle of order and strength, but today had revealed a truth she could no longer ignore. The vanguard's invincibility was a myth, and the Empire's vision of perfection was a fragile construct. She activated her personal log, her voice steady but thoughtful as she recorded her thoughts. Today, we faced an enemy who didn't just challenge our strength, they challenged our understanding of what it means to fight. The rebels showed us that survival isn't about overpowering your opponent. It's about outthinking them, adapting to the unexpected, and finding strength in unity. For the first time, I see the cracks in the foundation we've built. The vanguard isn't invincible. But perhaps that's not a weakness. Perhaps it's a reminder that we are, above all, human. As she finished the log, Rena felt a strange sense of clarity. The battle had been a failure by the Empire's standards, but it had opened her eyes to possibilities she hadn't considered before. The rebels had left a mark, not just on the battlefield but on her perspective. The next morning, as the sun rose over the crimson dunes, the vanguard prepared to move out. Rena stood at the forefront, her armor gleaming despite the damage it had sustained. Derek approached, his confidence partially restored. "Orders, Commander?" he asked. Rena looked out at the horizon, where the storm had cleared but its memory lingered. "We rebuild, we adapt, and we prepare for what's next. But this time, we don't just rely on our strength. We learn." Derek saluted, and the vanguard began their march back toward their ship. Rena followed, her steps resolute but her mind racing with possibilities. The rebels had given her more than a battle to remember, they had given her a reason to question everything. And for the first time in her career, she welcomed the uncertainty.